Hello, friends. It's Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers with another installment of our Shaping Vaping podcast on THR Nicotine Policy. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by our special guest, co-host, and truth sayer, Arielle Selya from Penny & Associates. Arielle, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me back on and elevating me to co-host this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, you should replace me and Joe altogether if we were smarter guys. But I should probably explain to our listeners, this is our special Dune edition because Arielle and I are both big fans of the Frank Herbert Dune novel series, which probably betrays our nerdy literature tastes. Are you going to go see the new film that's coming out, I wonder?
I sure am. I was watching the trailer for it this morning.
Yeah. I mean, I've read all the books, and I'm a much prefer the old 1984 David Lynch film to the new ones, which I think drift away from the deeper meaning and intent of the books. But I'm sure I'll hand over my $29 to whichever Hollywood company demands it.
Yeah, same. And it'll be interesting to see how they handle certain plot developments in the third movie.
And I'll make one recommendation before we dive into our chat, which is there's a great documentary I don't know if you've ever seen called Jodorowsky's Dune, and it's about the great Polish director Jodorowsky, who in the 1970s had the rights to the novels and was going to try to make a film. And he's kind of an avant-garde surrealist thinker, and he had lined up all these megastars to be in the film, and he had this fantastical vision for how to keep it true to the novels. And so for deep true Dune geeks, that's a highly recommended documentary, and because you can really see how his vision of it, which is, I don't know, super cool.
That is cool. I'll have to check that out. And one more question, if I can, on Dune.
Please.
So did you read, I read through the end of Frank Herbert's books, but that kind of leaves off partway through a trilogy. Like, have you read beyond that to the ones that his son finished, and would you recommend that?
Yes, I've read all of those, and I think the Frank Herbert ones are the best. But I did enjoy the other ones and would recommend them. And I also have like the whole graphic novel series too. So
cool.
I'm a huge graphic novel and comics geek. In addition, like, I don't know, I'm like betraying all of my nerdy background. But yes, I would absolutely.
You're in good company.
Yes. So today we're going to talk about a couple different things. The SRNT conference, which you attended. We're going to talk a little bit about the Rethinking Nicotine conference at which you presented. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the work you've been doing on assessing the scientific studies in the space and the limitations, flaws, and other skullduggery therein. But let me start with the SRNT conference, and we'll put a link in the chat, but I really commend people to read your Substack about this. I thought it was fascinating, your take on it. And I want to start with something that jumped out at me, Arielle, which was your sense that you were unwelcome there and that you felt, I don't know, a chill in the air. I'll let you go as far or characterize it as you wish, but I was so stunned by that. Because, unlike me, your work in this space is very measured, clinical, engaging. You try hard, I think, to be open-minded and invite feedback. And, you do such a superb job in trying to be conscientious. And so for me to read that you walked into that room and felt ostracized made me want to take my metaphorical 5-iron to the china cabinet. Tell us about that sense you had.
Yeah, thank you. So it's SRNT is always it's always a bit of a chilled reception. Like, I'm kind of afraid to say who I am. Like I always do, because I also don't want to give off or give anybody room to accuse me of like sneaking under the radar and infiltrating, or, so I'm always careful to disclose myself and who I work for. And, not everybody's like this. It really is a mixed bag. Like, there's some people that are very pro tobacco harm reduction at the conference that are happy to talk to me. There's a very vocal minority who does not want any industry there at all. And of course, direct industry employees can no longer attend or present. But for now, at least, the consultants have been sort of in this gray area where we're allowed to sort of be present, but I have not presented this year or last year either.
That strikes me as completely contrary to the whole ethos of scientific conferences. It helped me understand how those kinds of folks you're describing, I don't know, muster the nerve to exhibit that kind of hostility openly in that way. I mean, it seems to me it's like showing up drunk in church. I mean, what are they thinking?
I think they're still fighting the battles with the traditional tobacco companies from 50 years ago. They think the tobacco companies are still the same. There's a lot of assumptions about what nicotine industries are up to. There was a keynote this past year about how some of the newer companies are using the same tactics by the traditional tobacco companies. And they attempt to make parallels, but of course it's hard to do that without like actually talking to people from these industries and presenting our research. And I see the same thing in peer review too. So it's not just conferences, it's more and more journals that I try to submit my work to and that I have been able to publish in the past. And it's harder and harder to get anybody to accept it because more journals are now having a policy against not only tobacco funding, but nicotine industry funding. And very few journals make the distinction between the two. It's like if you're industry, then you're all lumped together as tobacco industry and therefore banned. But even the journals that don't have an explicit policy, I see comments from peer reviewers. I had one case about a year ago for a paper that's it's in PATH, public use data analysis. So if anybody has any qualms about the analysis that I'm doing, they're free to poke holes in it. They're free to do their own analysis and download it. But I got a comment, not to me from the peer reviewer, but anonymously to the editor saying, these people are funded by Juul, therefore their analyses can't be trusted. And when I pushed back a little bit, I asked, well, if there's anything we can do in the analysis, are there any concrete concerns that we can address to alleviate their concerns? And there weren't any.
You know, it's just the other part that, as I'm sure you can understand, that bothers me so much as a representative of American vapor manufacturers is that our entire membership is super hostile to the tobacco industry. The company that you're talking about, Juul, the initial motivating DNA of the company is to eradicate cigarette smoking. And so for them to like lump us in as, I don't know, proxies or masquerading as, tobacco companies in disguise is just so untrue, completely 180 at odds with what the reality is. And it's just super, super offensive.
Right. Yeah. It's really frustrating because I doubt they talk to people closely from in any industry. So they don't really understand the difference. It's like did you ever see that cartoon of New Yorker's mental map and like, New York takes up a lot of space and the rest of the country's squish. I feel like it's the same situation there. It's if they're not funded by academia or by NIH, then they think anybody else is industry and they're all lumped under the same umbrella.
Yeah, you're making me think, and I'll put a link in the chat about Noah Rothman's great book, Rise of the New Puritans, because these attitudes and motivations and actions remind me so much of like before the turn of the century and the great, spiritual revivals that led to the temperance movement, for example, or hostility to teaching theory of evolution in schools. And it's the same kind of black and white, good versus evil, religious zeal that is so characteristic of what you're describing, impervious to any kind of like reason or dialogue or even untethered from the realities of on the ground. It's so remarkable to me. I guess it's striking that this is being exhibited by people who are ostensibly among our smartest and deepest thinkers in our society. I mean, these are MDs and PhDs and MAs and, alphabet soup academic credentials, and yet they're behaving like, some rattlesnake tossing tent preacher.
Yeah, and it's frustrating because I've been on both sides, right? I've been the naive junior faculty member working in, or at least brought up in tobacco control. So I've really tried not to make inferences or assumptions about like their mental state when they're doing certain things, but they do the same thing to us. And like just one other example, which sort of ties into SRNT, is the NYTS release. Like Stanton Glantz and other people in tobacco control were like, oh, without NYTS 2025, that's like a gift to the industry. And it's like, no, it's not. Industry relies on that data too. It's important for everybody. It's important for regulators, for academics, for industry. Like,
yeah, we're going to touch on that in a moment. Because I think that's really fascinating, especially the way FDA reacted or failed to react or characterize that data. In fact, why don't we just talk about that now? That the NYTS data came out a few weeks ago, much delayed, and there was no public announcement. We talked about this with Cliff Douglas. Joe and I did last week, and that really struck me because the numbers are historically low, trending in what I think everyone agrees is a good direction.
mm-hmm.
And you'd think there'd be a ticker tape parade, and instead the FDA put out the findings with no comment whatsoever, not a syllable to say, no analysis. It was left to readers and stakeholders to do the analysis, which FDA typically does beforehand. And Cliff chalked that up, at least in part, he thought, to resource constraints at the agency and whatever staffing and bandwidth. And I replied to him this week online about that and said I'm not so sure. Like I'd be willing to entertain that idea if it weren't for the fact that these guys are out there on a soapbox pontificating about every topic under the sun all the time. Dr. McCary does a weekly, live podcast talking about all his favorite topics on and on. Yesterday, he did a tweet about warning Americans to be careful what kind of dye is in their green beer on St. Patrick's Day. And I'm like, listen, man, if you have the time to have a team build that video for you, but you've got nothing to say about the number one cause of preventable death in America, like, it seems like, I don't know, like what was your take? Like, it's hard for me to think that wasn't a willful silence, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think I might side more with Cliff on this, although it's hard for me to know. Like, I don't want to make inferences like people made inferences like, oh, it's a gift to industry. I do think that there were some challenges this year in FDA. So I sent you before the show a post that may be relevant to this. It's a post from Dr. Arielle, who used to work for one of the other federal agencies working on the NHIS. And he is now in his own consulting company, and he decided to publish the NHIS report anyway, kind of in his own capacity when it would typically be published in the MMWR, which also publishes the NYTS. And if you can scroll down a bit, he has...
That's all I've got. I'm sorry.
Sorry. There was a statement in there. Let me... I think I have...
The part that jumped out about me is give more money to the federal government. Or to be more accurate, take my money and give it to them. That's the part that grabbed my attention.
Yeah, that's worth talking about too. The one that jumped out to me, it says this report was initially submitted to MMWR, meaning the one that he published in that in the Public Health Journal.
Yeah.
The editorial team explained that with the loss of tobacco control expertise at CDC, they were unable to conduct the necessary review. So I can only imagine the same is true of publishing the NYTS MMWR. Although I don't know what kind of constraints FDA is under in terms of public communication, but I would have hoped to see at a scientific conference where literally the point of the conference is to present your preliminary work. I would have hoped to see some preliminary results, even if they're not fully peer reviewed and out. But I don't know what other constraints they might have been under.
I mean, I got to tell you, I do a lot of work in private industry with corporate clients. My clients at Home Depot take 1 million+ online orders a day. They deliver tens of thousands of dishwashers and washing machines and 2x4s all over this great country. And these guys can't look at a basic data of a chart they've been studying for years and dash up a paragraph about it. I mean, give me a break.
It got left to industry to do, right? Because Altria released their own very detailed analysis.
Right away.
That's, that ruffled some feathers too, but it's like, what do you expect?
And they had that out within what, 24 hours?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well,
and Christelle Nevo did too at Rutgers, who's doing tobacco surveillance in general, but the Altria's was very quick and very detailed.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Can't we deduce from that it ain't that hard? Seems like it. Well, I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Agaku's recommendation that the U.S. should restore the Office on Smoking and Health as the lead federal entity for comprehensive tobacco control, because I don't think they should. I actually don't think they should. These guys have been deceiving the American public for years. They ginned up that office is directly responsible for the misnaming and misleading the public over the so-called EVALI outbreak, which did catastrophic harm to public understanding. The numbers of Americans that are misperceiving the actual risk rates of different tobacco products, and especially the safer ones, is their fault. And so, yes, I suppose it's a central hub in a way, or has been the leading voice in tobacco control. But you know what? Maybe it's time they sat on the bench for a couple years. Maybe it's time throwing up one airball clunker, starting fistfights at midcourt. Maybe they should take a seat at the end of the bench and let some other people to do it. I mean, I'll ask it to you in a less loaded way, Arielle. Bearing in mind the trends that we're seeing in the data, like the youth tobacco survey, for example, do you think that those trends will be affected, in any way, especially adversely, by the fact that CDC's Office on Smoking and Health is sidelined?
Okay, that's a tough question to answer, because I do support surveillance efforts. I think the surveys should continue, NHIS and NYTS, without interruptions or without substantial changes to methodology, because that can throw off the trends, because they are useful to everybody. They're, and people, they're a tool, right? Like, they can be used in good ways and in bad ways. And I've seen a lot of academic publications use them in not so good ways. But it is there as a tool, and if the raw data are available, then that allows at least like somebody else to analyze the data and come away with a different perspective. As far as like messaging, like getting back to your original point, like messaging certainly is those dollars, I would agree, have not been well spent. They've more likely harmed public health, I think, than helped.
Yeah. I hasten to add, they've invited some of the absolute worst actors in nicotine prohibition world to actively partner with them, not just partner, but confer with them behind closed doors, in secret, out of view of the public eye, and help them shape policy. I mean, the corruption of that, it just staggers the conscience. And so, I guess, I hear what you're saying about the theoretical mission, but when you actually do give these guys the money and you actually do make them the prevailing voice, they don't spend it responsibly. They deceive people. They don't act ethically. They're corrupt as hell. They aren't helping people. They're actually making public health worse. And so get out of here is what I would say. I don't know. Like, I realize that's, as Joe often reminds me, I'm out on the wingnut libertarian fringe, but I think my expectation is having them sidelined is a good thing, and they need to spend a little time reflecting before they deserve the money from hardworking Americans who are doing something productive with their lives.
I do sympathize with that, because I feel the same thing with a lot of the NIH grant funding to tobacco research. Like, I've seen so much of it be misused. Large research grants that were canceled last year or the year before on how to make, I saw a presentation on what's it called? Graphic warning labels for e-cigarettes.
Right.
And it's like, well, what would you show? Like, what would you actually show as the harms? And they had a little cartoon of, metal particles in the lungs or something to that effect. And this was at a conference. It wasn't at SRNT. It was at a different conference, but this was like a large tobacco funded group. And the discussion in the audience was, well, maybe the images weren't scary enough. Maybe you need to make them scarier to have these graphic warning labels for e-cigarettes be effective. And I agree. I'm with you. That's a misuse of taxpayer dollars that's making things worse.
But isn't it, and that's been studied though. Like I find that part fascinating just from a communications theory perspective, which is my academic discipline. Because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but there have been many studies on whether those graphic warning labels have any effect. And if I'm remembering this correctly, it does not. There's no data that shows that has any impact on consumer behavior.
Yeah, I'd have to take a rain check on that one. I haven't looked into that literature in a while, but I kind of agree with you. Like, I think there's a lot of emphasis on these extraneous factors that tobacco control researchers think affect behavior. But I think a lot of it is more just intrinsic and like what people are already interested in. Like I've heard stories about people collecting graphic warning labels, like doing a collector card thing for graphic warning labels.
Yeah.
But that's certainly not having the intended effect.
Well, and there's another interesting facet of it, which is I think those warning labels and their production and their dissemination are an interesting window into the psychology of tobacco control, hardline tobacco control. I mean, if you haven't seen them, these warning labels are as lurid and garish as you could possibly imagine. They show all kinds of horrendous medical injuries, and I mean, it would make a Hollywood horror director think twice before showing some of this stuff. But it just I mean, you can kind of infer from that. That's how can I put it? That's how driven and adamant and intense those tobacco control people think about this issue.
Right. Because I think this is reasonable to some extent, but they're focused on the things that they can influence through policy. And like tax increases on cigarettes there is good evidence that deters especially young people from starting. But it's not like a linear return. Like you can't keep increasing taxes because then you get to a situation like Australia where official pack of cigarette, like through normal channels, is $50, and it's much cheaper in the illicit market. So like these things have diminishing returns at some point. And I think the evidence for anything except taxes is much weaker. But it's kind of like it's being treated as a known fact, and how much can it be ramped up to enact changes? But I think these are really diminishing returns.
Yeah, that's right. And they persist in it even when there's no efficacy or outcome that they prefer, or even if it makes the situation worse. I mean, that's the most disturbing facet of it, I think.
Yeah, and I see that in the literature week after week where there's some policy and they don't find any effects on actual use. So then they'll back up a step to look at things like use intentions or susceptibility. Or if that doesn't work, they'll back up even farther to risk perceptions. So it's like they're still trying to make this argument that there's an effect there, that there's an eventual downstream effect, but it's not like borne out by the data and the studies that are being presented.
Well, speaking of the data, I want to just loop back for a moment to what we were saying about the youth tobacco survey, because you may recall last summer when FDA, along with a lot of other federal partners like FBI and HHS and a bunch of gunslinging, uniformed, armed agents were kicking in the doors of small entrepreneurs and retailers. Dr. McCary said something that really jumped out at me. I don't have the card in front of me, so I'm going to recap it. But he basically said, "Oh, the youth tobacco survey and all that survey data that's been collected all these years, that's bunk. That ain't true, don't you know? Here's the proof. I myself have spoken with teachers all over this fair country," he pointed out, and best I can tell, about 50% of the kids, he said, are using vape products. That's the real number, he insisted. And so part of my pet theory is that they didn't want to comment or characterize the youth tobacco survey numbers because, of course, it would reveal that the head honcho at that agency is so far out of his depth, he looks like a fool.
Yeah, it's like I certainly don't agree with his statement because NYTS has been very consistent. So like you know you can nitpick about the exact methodology and the exact
Yeah.
estimates, but being able to follow it over time shows a clear, very large decrease since 2019, and that's just not up for debate.
Yeah, and that view I take it is shared across all battle lines in the space. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. And like I should also say I don't think McCary's views are held by like the people at FDA now. I'm sure they want the MMWR out too. Like I've heard that they're trying to pursue a publication elsewhere, but
Well, I mean, I don't know. The palace intrigue at FDA kind of interests me a little bit. I mean, they met, for example, with vape manufacturers a few weeks ago at one of the first kind of, you know, kumbaya powwows they've ever had with industry. And McCary showed up at that, but most of the speakers were the Office of Science and the legal guys and these career bureaucrats who've been climbing the greasy pole at FDA for years. And I got the strong impression that those folks have no real interest in any kind of reform or easing the process, and then it was just 8 hours of pure sugar frosted lip service. And I don't know, like again, it gets back to what we were saying about CDC a moment ago. Like you've DQ'd yourself, you've disqualified yourself from serious participation in this. You need to find something else to do with your life. When everyone got fired and ousted at the beginning of the administration from FDA, and they were you remember all the wailing to the church rafters, oh no, he had to walk out with this box of his belongings. I mean, I couldn't muster a tear for any of that. Good. I mean, I don't know. Like there's a point at which, and you see this in private. I see this in private industry all the time. Like, boards of directors and companies and people whose own skin is in the game, will try something, and if it doesn't work, like there's a point at which you cut the string on that balloon and let it float away. And I don't know. To my mind, FDA has long since passed that. I mean, if the head honcho can't even shoot straight about the benchmark centerpiece numbers in this space, like you're disqualified. It's like showing up to the symphony orchestra and playing a kazoo. Like, get out of here.
Yeah, no, I certainly get the frustration, especially with the NYTS thing. It's just, I don't know. I don't have insight into the inside. I'm sure there's good people there that are trying to do the right thing, but
yeah, this is a point that Joe and I wrangle about a lot, as I'm sure you've seen about, about their intentions and whether their heart's in the right place. And at the end of the day, I guess I'm sure they're nice people who pet their dogs and, tip waiters properly. But the question we're looking at is the outcomes, the results, and, what they're actually saying about the issues. And on all of those, they get straight across the board F for me anyway. Well, let's pivot for a moment to something more positive, so I don't get too far off in my wingnut ranting. There was another conference at which you did not suffer any side eye or cold shoulders.
Very welcome there.
And that was the Rethinking Nicotine Conference. And yes. Oh no, this is a different one. Hang on, I thought I had a slide on that. Tell us who sponsored that and what was the purpose of the conference?
Yeah, so that was sponsored by the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. There were some of them at University of Pittsburgh and some of them at the Community College of Allegheny. And they are kind of mainly working in there was a lot of libertarian presence there on like pro-drug legalization, but also right. People working like boots on the ground in harm reduction in other contexts, like opioid use disorder. And then just this whole conference was, hey, nicotine harm reduction is usually treated separate for whatever reason from other harm reduction efforts. So let's join them. Let's be aware of each other's circles, and let's make these more traditional harm reduction people aware of the conversations and the priorities in nicotine harm reduction.
That's great. I mean, that's great. And there were some along with your distinguished voice, there were a lot of other highly esteemed folks there. I mean, Cliff Douglas presented too. How did that go? Was there.
That was great. Yeah, he was a great first session speaker kicking it off.
I noticed Cliff had a really striking comment online this week about Mark Gunther's terrific piece faulting the Democrats for, driving nicotine policy in such a catastrophic direction. And to his immense credit, Cliff weighed in on that and gave a thoughtful comment about how he sees the same thing and really laments it. And the reason that's important is because Cliff has spent so much of his career working in close collaboration with those Democratic Party leaders. Let's remind our audience, he was President Obama's point man on tobacco control policy. And so he's got deep ties with that political world that's had such a stranglehold on this space. And I wonder if you were struck by that too. And I guess maybe a better way to ask it is, do you sense that view from being at SRNT, and you've been to many times before, and at the Pittsburgh conference, and in just your contemporary experience, do you sense that view is drifting? Are we gaining more adherence, I guess, to the THR cause?
Yeah, I saw it a bit at the Pittsburgh conference. Like, there was recognition by people other than Cliff and myself that, like, attitudes towards cannabis legalization or decriminalization are going one direction. Nicotine's going in the complete opposite, and this seems to be split along party lines for some reason. But I haven't heard that too many other places. But actually, one of the other things, and I didn't realize this until the Pittsburgh conference, but I learned that Massachusetts has two bills now, one for a nicotine generational ban and another one for recriminalization of cannabis, which surprised me. And that is something that I'm starting to see in the literature as well, where it's like vaping is just a knee-jerk reaction to anything vaping is so bad that the hysteria about nicotine vaping, I see it in some cases extending to cannabis vaping as well. So it's like we've kind of come full circle, where cannabis a couple of years ago used to be very supported. People supported legalization of it. And now, because it's, I don't, maybe I'm like making connections that aren't there, but it seems like the link is that if it's vaped, it's now becoming bad again.
I think I see a dichotomy there too. I see a growing number of adherents and a growing sensibility that vaping is vastly safer and helps people quit. And there was a Washington Post editor. I almost spit my coffee across the room when I read the Washington Post editorial this week, advocating in a full-throated voice for vaping as the best means to get people off of cigarettes, which is a 180 from where they had been for 10 previous years. So there's a great example there. But on the other hand, I think there's a kind of, how could I put it? Like a sort of revanchism going on. I mean, the comparison I'll make is two other issues that I've done some work on. And one is about genetically modified foods, and the other is nuclear energy. And in both of those spaces, a similar thing happened, where initial hardcore prevailing resistance to both of those fields predominated the policy. But over time, more and more of the, leading authorities and voices and the prevailing consensus is that both of those things are vastly safe and very low risk for super high benefit for society. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a hardcore activist base that's very, very small, but who still have a stranglehold on both of those industries. So in genetically modified foods, for example, there's a product called golden rice, which could eradicate river blindness, which blinds and kills hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children every year. But if they eat this rice with a nutrient in it, it prevents them from contracting the disease. And yet, because of the hardcore, super radical activists, it can't be produced. And the same thing in nuclear energy. Like you if you watch, any of the news or read the New York Times, you can't go, 8 paragraphs without reading something about climate change and the catastrophic, consequences that are looming over us. And yet nuclear energy, which is the cleanest, safest form, most powerful form of energy, you can't open a nuclear power facility in this country for that same reason. So that really makes me it makes me very worried about the outcome, because although we're gaining more adherence, and although I think our side has has the moral and empirical high ground, we may not prevail for that reason. I worry that we'll follow the same path. I don't know, your thoughts.
Yeah, I have mixed thoughts on that too. I do see, like, even at SRNT, there does seem to be more recognition about harm reduction, especially for pouches. So some people that have been very anti-harm reduction in the past said that pouches might be good for harm reduction from not only from cigarettes, but e-cigarettes and smokeless tobacco as well. So like, I feel like some of the message is getting through, but then at the same time, I do see examples like with the cannabis vaping where the hysteria is spreading. Like there's all these contradictions and double standards and how people's attitudes towards nicotine versus cannabis, even caffeine, alcohol. And I'm, at first I would point those out every time I see them, like, well, coffee and alcohol are free flowing at this conference, for example.
Yeah.
And I kind of hesitate to point out the parallels because it seems like instead of looking at their view of caffeine, say, or alcohol, and saying, okay, well, we treat that reasonably. Like instead of extending the rationality to nicotine, it's going the other way.
Yeah.
So I reviewed a paper a couple of weeks ago that was painting non-alcoholic drinks as a gateway to alcohol use, using the same logic, the same gateway argument that I've been arguing against for 10 years now.
Well, maybe that's a better way to ask it, Arielle. If we're gaining more of a consensus on the realities of low-risk nicotine products, are studies of the kind you're describing becoming more prevalent? Another way to ask it is, in their desperation and in their shrinking, number of adherents, are they becoming louder and more brazen about some of these scientific analyses? I mean, here's one right here that would seem to argue, yes, they are.
Yeah, this one was a very glaring example. Like, not that it was uniquely bad. There's plenty of, I probably see, like a handful of these types of systematic reviews every month that look at some outcome and they pool together all these different measures, and there's the same underlying flaws. It's a garbage in, garbage out situation, right? Because in the human epidemiology studies, they're almost all cross-sectional analyses of NHANES or something, and they correlate e-cigarette use with some outcome. And they essentially, what the analysis is doing, if it's not very careful, is it's taking lingering effects from cigarette smoking and blaming it on vaping. This one was also bad in additional ways. And it's hard for me to look. So yeah, I guess let me go into the concerns. Essentially, they had, like, for every systematic review, you have to pre-register the search criteria, what kind of outcomes you're including, whether you're including like human studies, animal studies, that sort of thing. They drastically changed the actual end list of papers from their pre-registered plan for this. So initially in my reading, they wanted to look at human-only studies among never smokers, which is a good idea because it eliminates this confounding by prior smoking issue. But then in the actual paper, without disclosing these very large changes from the original registered protocol, they broadened it to include biomarker studies, non-human studies, and even the human studies they broadened to include smokers too. So you're like drastically expanding the net, catching all sorts of studies. And it's hard for me to read this list of changes, undisclosed changes, and think that it was anything other than they didn't find what they wanted to in human studies of non-smokers, so they wanted to broaden the search to find some harm. Yeah.
And of course, raise the specter of cancer, which was such a strong leverage point in their battles of yore against combustible cigarettes. You can easily see why that would have appeal for them. And from my perspective, I see this as part of an engineered public relations strategy. I mean, the Bloomberg world has vertically integrated that so that every element of these stories, from the fundamental science to getting it in the hands of handpicked, often bribed journalists, propagating it, amplifying it on digital. I mean, that's all a vertically integrated part of what you would do in a public relations campaign, and made worse by the fact that Bloomberg is using it is putting in his own team of political experts. So they're using not simply tools that you might use to, I don't know, launch a new kind of chewing gum or publicize an event, but the communication strategies and tools that are used to leverage a political outcome. And so it's so far divorced from what the science intends. I mean, I'll give you another example of this that jumped out at me from your great Substack. I'm just going to flag your Substack about another meta-analysis that was done by not much of a friend of the show, Dr. Stanton Glantz. And you did a scorching, well, not scorching. It was actually very measured. If I wrote it, it would be scorching. You did, I thought, of like a very adjective-free clinical assessment on this. But just notice, I went and looked at what Glantz had to say. Notice what he had to say. He says
findings are unlikely to be results of confounding.
Yeah, he says all the studies controlled for smoking, but that's not true.
So technically, it's true in that they controlled for smoking status, meaning a 3-level or 2-level categorical variable with whether you currently, formerly, never smoked. But that's not sufficient, obviously. What we see in a lot of these studies is that the highest risk is for among former smokers. And that's maybe because they had, they were the ones experiencing health effects, and that motivated them to stop. So there's like an element of reverse causality in there that's not being accounted for. There's an element of just dose response, like asking somebody if they currently smoked. It can capture anywhere from experimentation to long-term 30-pack year history. And it's almost never controlled for. There are a few studies that look at that, and generally the ones that do, if they control for pack years of smoking history, and if they control for former smokers, how long they've been quit, that often explains away the association.
Yeah, and there's another disturbing phenomenon. Joe and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There's a famous chess player I admire, a Russian player whose name was Mikhail Tal, and his strategy in playing chess was, he said, to drag my opponent into a deep, dark forest where there's no path out. And you kind of see that in what Glantz is doing. You get further and further down this, labyrinth of claims, and even what you just described, I think would be lost on a lot of lay readers. And so when you're the Crayola journalist at USA Today, who are you going to believe? Credentialed hero Dr. Glantz and his pals at the American Cancer Society, or the researcher who has shown that the math is wrong
and who takes money from industry?
That's why a political, the nature of it as a political campaign, that they're using a politicized strategy in order to leverage the outcome they want. And I'll show you what that outcome is. Here's another thing that Glantz said in that same kind of explanation. This one is just, the depravity of it is staggering. He says, we needed to do a careful reassessment of the assumption that e-cigarettes are less harmful alternative to cigarettes. He says, particularly given the fact that e-cigarettes are not associated with increased smoking cessation. In fact, he says, e-cigarettes are associated with less cessation. In other words, like you see, like there's the headline for USA Today.
Yeah, no, this is incredibly frustrating because he knows enough to describe it in a way that it seems like he's preemptively addressing all the criticisms.
Right.
But you really have to, and I said this at the Rethinking Nicotine panel. I talked about common flaws that I see in the literature. And one of the questions from the audience is like, well, how do we do better? And I'm like, I don't know of a better solution than you have to become an expert in everything. And I'm sure that's the purpose of my presence on social media, is to try to help people be more informed consumers and critical thinkers about the science. And I think that's helping, but I'm only one person and my voice isn't very big. And then you have people have like an established record, like Stanton Glantz, saying, "Oh, there's no confounding, and e-cigarettes are not associated with smoking cessation." And it's like, I can debunk all of those claims, but it's going to take me, like, I need to go into rabbit holes, and it's going to take me a lot longer to address all these points.
Well, let me give you a potential solution that I've been, thinking about for some months now. And it has to do with media criticism and the way that these kinds of bunk studies find their way into mainstream media coverage, which has such a profound impact on people's perceptions. And it has to do with the way in many countries they've established what's called a news council, which is kind of a jury of professionals in journalism that adjudicate coverage or individual stories that are in some kind of dispute over their factual basis or what was left out based on journalism standards. So in Canada, for example, any reader or the subject of a story can go to Canada's News Council and say, "Hey, I think this article was wrong. Here's why. I would like you guys to adjudicate it." And they'll convene a panel, usually of 10 or a dozen professionals, who will all read it, measure it against a set of established, accepted standards, and then issue findings and based on a set of criteria. And they also can add their own comments to it. And then they make the results public. Now, they can't and shouldn't be able to tell a news outlet, you can't say X or you're prevented from saying Z. Sure. But they can say 12 professionals looked at this and thought that it was, garbage on toast and ought to be thrown in the parrot cage. And that, I think, would be something that could be replicated in our space. I mean, just think, Arielle, of all the many different credentialed, serious thinkers, yourself included, and Cliff or Joe or, a long list of others who are doing the kind of analysis you described on their own individual basis. But all of their comments and findings are disparate. And so you're right. In the eyes of, let's say, a New York Times reporter who might be tempted to report on what Glantz is saying, you may be, in their eyes, the only critic out there who doesn't have his background. But if it was 12 people from a cross section of expertise with credential things all in one place saying that, the impact would be enormously magnified. And I think the logistics of it are quite simple. It's you're basically just doing a checklist analysis. It would take no more time than all of these folks are already spending doing the kind of critique that you're describing. So how does that possibility strike you?
I think that's important because there's so many, like you said, it's not just me doing this. There's a number of other people, including the people that got the consultant group that got the cancer paper retracted. Right. They did a fantastic letter to the editor, but it does feel like we're working in isolation, and it's a very slim chance of success for each individual thing. But the flaws are so common. It's like confounding by smoking history. Right. Even in the second clip that you showed, or the second quote from Stan Glantz about e-cigarettes are not effective for cessation. That's a clear thing to disprove now with the Cochrane review. Like, Cochrane finds high quality evidence, and that doesn't take too much effort to debunk. Slowly. It's incredible that he would say that. It's incredible that he would say that with a straight face. Yeah. Right. And some of his own papers show that. So I think there was one paper, can't remember which year or which one, but I think he broke it down by daily vaping and non-daily vaping. And even he found a positive effect for daily vaping on later cessation. Right. And this gets me back to like what we said earlier on the various bureaucrats at CDC and FDA. Does it matter whether Stan Glantz walks his dog or, is a fun guy to have a beer with or roots for the Dodgers? Or that's irrelevant. Mm-hmm. It's irrelevant. Yeah. So I want to move on to something that you flagged, which is one of my favorite hobby horses in the world of tobacco research, which is the mouse studies. The mouse study, yes. Let's torture the mice. Yes. What happened to these poor okay, rodents? So these poor mice, and I don't usually I do not go into detail on the mouse studies because there's always the big umbrella of like, is this relevant? Is this going to extend to humans? Is it relevant to human health outcomes? I'm not usually convinced of either of those things, but this one I thought was worth discussing because even within the framework, like let's give them several concessions. Like let's assume that this is relevant, that the results are real, replicable, relevant to human health. Even then, and this is like one of my pet peeves in the literature, is how are they interpreting their results in a way that's consistent, or is there evidence of bias? So these mice were trained with, they were trained to nose poke to receive vapor, and it could be one of a couple different flavors. I think vanilla, menthol. At one point they tried cherry, and with or without nicotine. So they looked at the flavor effects on their own, and the effect of nicotine on its own, and then some of the flavor nicotine combinations. So then if we skip to the figure that I highlighted.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this was really striking to me because some of it's what you'd expect, like nicotine and menthol in the green bar is that evokes like the highest number of nose pokes. And that's evidence for that it's more reinforcing than the other conditions. So like the control is the PG VG alone. So that's like no flavoring, no nicotine at all. That's the control. So the nicotine in menthol is particularly reinforcing. Other papers have shown that. Vanilla is also reinforcing, but only really on its own. All of a sudden, if you add nicotine, it becomes significantly less reinforcing. So that's the yellow and gray checkered is the vanilla plus nicotine. So this really stood out to me because the overall conclusions of the paper are, oh, vanilla is reinforcing on its own, and therefore it might contribute to abuse liability in nicotine vapes. But they don't really address the fact that adding nicotine to vanilla makes it less palatable. So like, I'm thinking if an alien from another planet were to come and interpret the results of this study, if the authors want vapes to be less, have lower abuse liability, wouldn't that be a case for adding vanilla to nicotine?
Right.
But of course, like nobody's going to recommend that.
Yeah. The policy results always only goes in one direction, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah.
It's really.
I thought that was a pretty interesting example of that, where it's like if it turned out the other way, you know what they would conclude, but this one, it's like kind of brushed aside and just to focus on the vanilla.
It reminds me of the mouse study that is the foundation for all the claims that nicotine damages the adolescent brain. I mean, that's all fundamentally based on a mouse study, isn't it?
Yeah, as far as I know. My colleague Lynn Dawkins has done a deep dive on that recently, so maybe she can speak to that at some point. But yeah, it seems like it's mainly based on animal work.
But don't we have a larger cohort study of sorts about whether nicotine causes brain damage in the tens of millions of Americans like myself who started smoking when they were teenagers? I mean, wouldn't you expect we'd be, I don't know, walking around with like Frankenstein bolts if that were true?
Yeah, definitely there should be, like if there was a clear signal in the epidemiology, like yes, it's less certain data because of confounding, blah, blah, blah. But we were still able to identify a lung cancer link even with observational data like that.
That's a pretty big observation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. Would I have otherwise been the conductor of the National Symphony if I hadn't smoked when I was 16?
Yeah, and having come into this field sort of after the kind of landmark psychology studies, I go into some of these studies with I end up regretting that I'm so trusting when I go into some of these studies. So I thought it was well established until a year or two ago that nicotine has some cognitive, adverse cognitive effects or cognitive impairments, so to speak, with attention. Yeah. And then I looked into the underlying studies, like the older psychology ones, and I'm like, all it's doing is it's testing people in a nicotine deprived state and testing their attention and suppression of attention to a smoking related cue. And it's do they have a caffeine condition? Because if they put me in a similar experiment in the morning before I've had my coffee, I'm sure I'd be going for the coffee images too.
I mean, there's another corollary effect to what we were talking about before. When those kinds of studies are put out and the messaging is presented to the press and then disperses into the public discourse, it's already distorted enough, as Glantz demonstrates a moment ago, but it then gets compounded. And so what you see in headlines and social media and other places is nicotine causes brain damage, which is not really at all even what the misguided study was saying in the first place. But those people, the original authors and the propagators of that notion, do zero to clean up on aisle 6. They're glad to let that spin out in all sorts of directions. And that too is a feature of what you see in political communication. So someone will do a negative ad that has a lot of innuendo and inferences, and the viewer concludes, I hate that person. They should be gibbeted for treason. And the person propagating the message is glad to have the listeners spin off into all those, heated conclusions. And the same thing happens here. It's political messaging that they know or hope, intend is going to result in these lurid conclusions among the public. I mean, the data shows that's what causes the misperceptions. And, and where's FDA cleaning that up? Where's CDC, Office of Smoking and Health? I mean, I see Joe in our chat sticking up for those folks. Where are they? I invite anyone to point to a single attempt by any of those people to set straight the misperceptions.
Yeah, it's frustrating reading some of these claims as a scientist, because it's like, okay, they technically phrased it correctly where they didn't use word language that was explicitly causal, like the gateway claims, right? Like I would say 10 years ago, gateway claims in the media used to be sort of causal, at least in some cases. But these days, they're phrased a lot more carefully to say, oh, youth who vape are 3 times as likely to smoke. So they're avoiding making an explicit claim, but it still gives that impression.
Yeah. It's disturbing, and I don't know. It's hard for me to. This is why I part ways with people who argue that their heart's in the right place, or these are dedicated. I mean, this is willful. I mean, I don't know. It's intentional. I mean, I hate to say that.
And Mirror article too. That was probably the most glaring example, where it was like multi-organ failure from vaping, and it wasn't. They didn't look at clinical outcomes at all. And in fact, I'm willing to make a bet on this. Maybe I'll be wrong, maybe not. Yeah. But in my experience, since that Mirror article came out, knowing some of the designs of these exercise science studies, it's typically 20 people in each group, and they just do a straight comparison. So I reviewed one that I think I improved quite a bit, if not perfectly, where the e-cigarette group happened to be 80% female. And so because of that, they had a slightly higher BMI than the smoker or the non-smoker group, who were more male, or it was at least a 50-50 split. And the original title of this article was Metabolic Consequences of E-Cigarette Use. And it was completely uncontrolled. It was comparing a group that was mostly female against a group that was mostly male.
I mean, you touched on this a little bit, in your Substack here. Good news is dismissed and misrepresented as indistinguishable from approaching cigarette use, while similar size differences are emphasized. And so, even in the data itself, although it may be fundamentally, mathematically accurate, empirically accurate, the way that it's presented is always with this Beethoven music. Why is that?
Yeah. Because that's the story that they want to tell in the abstract. And there's always some of that, you can't just publish a scientific paper with a bunch of tables and no text and no interpretation. So some of that is reasonable, because you want to help people, you want to walk people through the results and explain what you are taking away from the results. But when it's so imbalanced like this, that's a problem, because most people are so stretched for time. If anybody's consuming, forget about headlines. If anybody's clicking on the actual scientific study, they're just going to read the abstract 90% of the time. They're not going to go into the full text and see what results were presented that didn't make it into the abstract write-up, or how are some of these being misinterpreted. And that's just the story that's being spun over the numbers.
Yeah, it's troubling. And again, this is what bleeds into the press coverage too. And that's why I think I think about this a lot in my other work and other industries, but sort of severing that symbiosis between the activist world and the press world, and by holding the press accountable to its own standards is so crucial, because, you know, they're getting a free ride from the people that are charged by society with looking at things objectively and holding power accountable. And, you know, that's a place where we've got to, you know,
I agree, but I think it's hard for them too if they're not a scientist. Like the quotes that you showed from Stan Glantz's blog, it's like that looks very convincing. Even if you are scientifically minded and you read him claim that, oh, it's not likely confounding, like that people, they might be doing their job, but unless they're like a statistician, that might fool them.
Well, again, I struggle with this too, because I think that I think you're generous to give a lot of the journalists on this topic the benefit of the doubt, and there may be some neophytes, it's true, that can't sort through it. There are others whose entire beat, their full entire job is covering this industry, and I'm talking about reporters like Christina Jewett at the New York Times, or Jennifer Maloney at the Wall Street Journal, or Matt Perrone at the Associated Press. And a number of others who know this stuff intimately. It's their entire job. And, you know, when someone has, you know, lung injury, they're happy to splash that all over Hell's Half Acre, but you never, ever, ever see them quote a single person who has successfully quit smoking with vaping, although there are tens of millions of them in America. And I think, from where I sit, you can confidently deduce that that's a willful slant,
or where the money's at, right? Like negativity bias.
Yeah, there's some of that, although, you know, you could just as easily cut that the other way. I mean, FDA is causing vast harm to the tens of millions of Americans who are smoking with their obstinate, blinkered, you know, Crayola approach to the topic. So you could cover it in that way. And oh, by the way, you'd be holding power accountable, derp, derp, derp. But again, they don't do that, you know?
That's a fair point.
Yeah. I mean, I'll add one of my favorite examples of this kind of bias. This is a movie review. This is a movie synopsis that was famous in the newspaper years ago, which is 100% accurate. And it's about the Wizard of Oz. Transported to a surreal landscape, a young girl kills the first person she meets, then teams up with three strangers to kill again. And again, like in the journalism world, they use that Mott and Bailey, you know, rhetorical deceit in which they would say, "Oh, it's perfectly accurate. Show me. We don't have to publish a correction. This is entirely true." And so I think that subjectivity that you're getting at, you know, strikes at the heart of the problem. It's a really intellectually dishonest way to look at this issue.
That's a good example.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites, because you hear that excuse from journalists all the time. Oh, there's no error.
Right. Yeah.
Show me where the mistake is. I'm really careful, don't you know?
Right.
So forgive me for venting all my frustrations, Arielle, but it's, you know, it's tough to see this, and all of our members are trying so hard to help people quit smoking. I mean, I think of the quote from Michael Siegel from Tufts University, who calls vape shops smoking cessation clinics. And you want to talk about heart in the right place. I mean, every single one of our members, especially the retailers, all got into this because they were smokers and they experienced how vaping can help them quit cigarettes. And they wanted to share that with their fellow Americans. Right. And they're doing that with their own hearts and their own hands and their own money. I repeat, their own money, putting that on the line to help other people. And so to see them get, you know, trashed in this deceitful political way just it's really maddening.
Yeah.
Well, I want to end with our usual macro view, and it's about optimism and pessimism. I mean, from where I sit, I'm really worried about how the current administration, I guess you could call it the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which is in control of all these agencies, is not only just as bad as their predecessors in the Biden administration or earlier, I'd argue they're almost worse because they're doing heavy-handed enforcement in a way that Dick Durbin and Matt Myers and all the most hardline Puritans on the other side wouldn't even have dared to attempt to do. And their lip service double talk is also worse. When you recall in the Biden administration, Brian King, who headed Center for Tobacco Products, would occasionally say, "Oh yes, vaping is safer and it helps you quit smoking," and then do the exact opposite. But you know, the Secretary of HHS, Robert Kennedy, said that out loud. Vaping is the safest way to do it, except for pouches. We should get people off cigarettes. And Dr. McCary said the same thing in a recent show. We'll put it in the chat. But where the rubber hits the road, they're saying that the youth tobacco numbers are bunk. We need to kick more doors down. You know, so I think so. The problem I see is we have these the two predominant political forces in America are both, you know, completely hell bent against us. So I have a tough time seeing optimism out, except for the courts. And I think the federal courts may be the one remedy for policy. But on the other hand, Arielle, I feel really heartened by what you've reported and what Cliff Douglas has said and others about how it seems like, or the Washington Post example, how it seems like the center of gravity in, let's call it, authoritative understanding of the core aspects of this issue is becoming heavier and denser and more of a consensus. So I don't know. I hate to be equivocal about it, but that's the pessimistic and the optimistic, you know, silos that I'm struggling with. How do you see it?
Yeah, I see mixed signals too. I think in general it seems to be moving in the right direction. I think it's it's a lot less controversial now to say people who smoke are better off switching completely. I don't think anybody at SRNT even would really object to that anymore, whereas it used to be controversial a few years ago, especially for pouches. Like e-cigarettes are still somewhat hesitation just because of the youth thing, but even that's going away now.
But does that optimism come with a risk, though? I mean, is it possible we're walking down a dark alley
the risk I see
in the place where GMO foods and nuclear energy were?
It's possible. I would say, like, the risk I see in my pessimistic scenario is that as we as a society are getting less risk tolerant, and with smoking about to be like essentially eradicated among younger generations, the public health efforts are focused on they're chasing smaller and smaller harms. So like nicotine use, even caffeine, alcohol, like as much as I think there's huge double standards in the way those substances are treated, I see, like, I guess in my pessimistic scenario, the alarmism is spreading. And I see that in some places as well.
Yeah, it's troubling. I mean, I see that across all of my work. You know, I've worked for 20 plus years for the tuna industry, you'll be amused to know. And the big three tuna labels of canned tuna are my clients. Very hugely popular product. And the accusation there is that it contains mercury, and that if you give your kids a tuna fish sandwich, they'll get brain damage. And, you know, that uses the same kind of research chicanery that we've been examining, the same kind of, you know, channeling messaging mechanisms with the press that we're seeing. And, you know, it spreads into other product areas. I mean, we work with the bottled water industry a lot, and you see the same thing there too. I repeat, bottled water. Okay. You couldn't conceive of a more fundamentally natural product. And you would be staggered to see the list of influencers and wellness editors and, you know, commentators and science journalists who are like, it's got
it's hard because, like, yeah, I've heard that too, and it's like it's hard for me to know what to trust anymore. Like, I've heard awful things about farmed salmon. I've heard great things about.
I work for them too.
You work for them too? Yeah.
Yes.
So and it's unfortunately, like, I have to be an expert in everything. I have to question everything that I'm hearing because I don't know like what kind of science it's based on.
Well, I mean, I just, as a layperson, I beg my friends in the scientific world to notice that phenomenon, because they are drinking from a poison chalice when they give in to the temptation to mislead the public in this way.
Yeah.
Because, although they make it some short-term effect, people will, I don't know, refrain from eating farm salmon, or they'll, have chicken instead of tuna, or they'll try Chantix instead of a vape.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever outcome you're leveraging in the near term, it comes at a huge cost to the credibility and reliability of the scientific world. And, that's a serious problem. And forgive me, but I really fail to see any kind of course correction or sobriety from the public, from the scientific world, about that erosion.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of optimism there either, because I think the way that the academic research incentives are structured, you have to hyper focus on something, and there's more and more specialization, and that like prevents people or actively discourages people from taking a step back and asking, like, for example, like, well, is vaping the worst thing to happen to? Is that the worst thing that kids are doing? What about binge drinking? What about drinking and driving? But you're disincentivized, or like sometimes even almost punished doing that, and like straying from your straight and narrow lane.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And there's also, like, I see a phenomenon where risk-taking behavior, even smoking, is now regarded as, sort of risque or countercultural or nihilist, because fundamentally those individuals don't want to listen to the authorities anymore, and they don't want to take seriously the risks and harms that are presented to them, or maybe they can't differentiate or do, have no guidance for risk assessment. And so they're kind of like, Weimar Berlin, just throw caution to the wind. Let's go to the nightclub and bring it all on. That's another really troubling phenomenon. I mean, I was going to put up a screenshot. I don't have it. I'll put it in the thread about our friend of the show, Nick Green, and his other YouTube guys are constantly getting dinged and delisted and demonetized and punished by social media platforms for talking about tobacco harm reduction. And yet at the same time, there was an article in New York Post this week about one of the emerging, most hottest influencers is a guy. All he does all day long, he day drinks and smokes cigarettes on his live stream, and just talks about the experience and does cigarette reviews and,
oh my gosh,
and drinks, whatever, malt liquor and wild turkey, and does that like at 8 a.m. on a Thursday. And it's a huge follower count, and whatever, it's like, no one cares.
Yeah, no one cares.
It's really disturbing. In fact, next time around when we have you back on, I want to talk. He did a really interesting review of VLN cigarettes, and it was really curious. Like if nothing else, he's an expert smoker. Like, he knows what he's talking about with cigarettes. And so it was really interesting to hear his take on that. And another good example of how what's happening in the real world is completely removed from what's happening in the academic ivory tower. I somehow doubt Stan Glantz is even aware of a channel like that, or even knows an individual who smokes, or I don't know.
Right.
It was like with the New York Times the other day. They did that the article on how FDA might indulge flavors, and the author of the piece, Christina Jewett, was describing nicotine pouches, and she says, "Oh, it's a product that you put, between your upper lip and your gum." And I thought to myself, like, I mean, some people do it that way, but that's not. That's like saying Coca-Cola is a beverage that must be consumed in a glass with ice. And like, you just betray your complete ignorance about the product.
Right.
And then the answer occurred to me. She doesn't know anyone who uses that product. She's never used that product.
Yeah.
And so it's really, I don't know, it's sort of troubling. Well, here's the good news, Arielle. I don't have to do any show notes or prep for next week's show, because in our sidebar comment thread, Joe Gitchell has backseat driven every single thing that we can talk about next week. I'm counting at least 24 corrections, clarifications.
Oh, good.
Nuances that I'm going to need to address the next time
Thanks,
around.
Joe.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Since Joe is silent, I'll refrain from any cheap jibes, except to say, appreciate the input. And Joe, and this is our roadmap for next week. You can explain to me the error of my ways on all these various aspects.
Yeah. I'm on your side of the wing, I think, a little bit. So
yeah,
we missed our balance this week.
I guess we did. Although again, let's emphasize. I mean, I wonder if you see this too. There's a good way to bookend it with if you experience a cold shoulder at SRNT, do you see, as I do, the same kind of ecumenical, broad-based, full-spectrum ideology in the THR world that I take such heart in? I mean, in all these other spaces I work, it's rare for me to have allies and comrades of a sort from the left side of the aisle or outside of the libertarian pro-business wing. But in THR, oh my gosh, it's like a cornucopia of people of all kinds of cross-section of ideology, expertise, economics, and so forth. I wonder if you notice that too.
Yeah. I think the THR community is much more spread out like that. Whereas I think anything that's comprised of traditional academics, I think is going to be more on one side of the aisle.
Well, the other nice thing is, selfishly, I think it's one of the great ways to evangelize for libertarianism, because we're all in our silos and our lanes and our bubbles, and I think a lot of people don't often get to hear or experience up front where libertarians come down on this kind of stuff. So I was joking with Cliff and Joe. We were complaining about the Democratic Party's intransigence and the failures of the bureaucratic state and how things could be fixed. And I was joking with those guys, like, you're this close, and I'm going to keep 2 seats warm for you out here on the wingnut fringe.
Yes.
When you're ready to pull that string below the light bulb, I've got 2 seats for you
so
guys.
close, almost there.
Yeah, I'll give you each a Budweiser, and we'll all be happy. So anyway, that's where we'll pick it up next week. In the meantime, Arielle, large thanks and lots for joining us. You're such a thoughtful person in this space. I really appreciate all your time and input.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Well, let's find water and shade.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Exactly. And let's make it to be continued. Here's hoping we can have you back again.
Yes, love to be back.
All right. Well, this is Jim McCarthy from American Vapor Manufacturers, on behalf of AVM and Arielle Selya from Pinion Associates. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.